So we have Angus Kennedy, convener of the Academy, author of Being Cultured, to discuss Aeneas, pious son, man of war.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Okay, it's a big book in many ways. I hope you've read all of it. The bad news is I've got to concentrate on the end, which for some people is not always the most appealing part of it, the second half of the Aeneid War in Italy. Maybe less appealing to the modern reader sometimes in the first 6 books, sometimes called the Odyssey in the Aeneid, the journey and the adventures which started with Aeneas and took together. For some reasons, the second half gets a little the Iliadic Aeneid. You accept that division, but that division is not always useful. You can start by thinking about it being the Odyssey, the first 6 books, the Iliad being the last 7. But oftentimes they're turned around. Sometimes Aeneas is Achilles, sometimes it's Hector, Trojan as well. It works on many levels. What I'm going to say to start with is sort of a little bit about what is this book, the Aeneid, that we're dealing with. What's the context in which it's written? What are some of its themes? And a little bit about what the Roman view of morality was at the time. And that's our overall theme. And then try by discussing, in particular, the war, the violence, and the killing of Turnus right at the end. To what degree the Aeneid reflects upon some of those moral attitudes that were prevalent in Rome at the time. Aeneas, as I think I said in sort of one-page blurb I gave on this, Aeneas is characterized throughout the Aeneid by one key word, pietas. A difficult word to render into English maybe, but Cicero, if he can be any guide to this, as a man of the times, defined it as the virtue which admonishes one to observe duty to fatherland, parents, and blood relations. And if we translate it as righteousness, then Aeneas seems to be presented to us as a man who does the right thing, follows his ordained path towards the foundation of Rome. And we can look at whether or not we think in what ways that view of piety is borne out through this story. But let me take you, that said about the end, let me take you right back to the beginning, just to warm us up. Arms and the man I sing of Troy. So I'm going to talk about a man and war. Who first from its seashores, Italy bound, so immediately come from Troy to go to Italy, right there, right together. Fate's refugee, arrived at Lavinia's coastlands. How he was battered about over land, over high deep seas, across the whole world. By the powers above, savage Juno's anger remembered him, as he suffered profoundly in war to establish a city. That's what he's doing. And we see other people trying to establish cities, and give laws, and make settlements. Dido, for example, Evander, and so. To establish a city, settled his gods into Latium, making this land of the Latins, future home to the elders of Alba and Rome's mighty ramparts. Throughout the Aeneid, we have a play of different temporal perspectives. He's founding something that already exists for the implied reader. Not only exists in the form of Augustus' Rome, in which Virgil is writing, but it already exists in the time frame of the Aeneid. He goes there, and he's in Rome, being shown Rome as it was then, the vision of the Rome that he will create. Muse, let the memories spill through me. What divine will was wounded? What deep hurt made the queen of the gods thrust a famously righteous man into so many spirals of chance to face so many labors? Anger so great, can it really reside in the spirits of heaven? And we're off. That's the beginning. So what sort of book is this? In the readings I gave you for this, it was a useful chapter from the Cambridge History of Classical Literature by Derek Williams, chapter 18 on the Aeneid, which I think is useful reading for you if you haven't already, to go back to that. He quotes at the end of it some opinions. A French literary critic in the 19th century, Saint-Beuve, said it was a tendresse profonde, deep, tender book. Matthew Arnold, talks about the haunting, the irresistible self-dissatisfaction of his heart. We find in Virgil, on the one hand, a view of society, the Roman Empire, which he's celebrating, which is ordered, and to be ordered, and to be great, which is sort of a hard view. This is maybe the Aeneas of the latter 6 books, and he's worked out what he's going to do and committed to it. And against that idea of an ordered society, the idea of an individual lost, buffeted by powers outside his control, journeying in the first 6 books. And also, to some degree, a question of whether or not that ordering of society involves a loss of the individual. And many people read Virgil as having a profound and tender sympathy for those lost individuals, the ones that die in the course of the book, just disappear from view. Palinurus, the helmsman, is suddenly, immediately surplus to requirements when the boats land. He's gone, he's dead. But his father dies, Dido dies, Pallas dies, Turnus dies. There are a list of lost individuals that Virgil presents us with, giving meaning that one of the little phrases, lacrimae rerum, there are tears in things, or the tears of things, is one of the phrases that's often remembered as giving us a view into Virgil and his attitude. The book itself, the Aeneid, also is consciously trying to connect legend with the modern world. So Virgil's often very interested in the etiology of words, the cause of them, how they came to mean what they do. And he does some of it through lots of punning, use of anagrams. So I was mentioning to some people before this place where they fight, Latium, which is an anagram of the Latin verb malavit, it is preferred. Roma, the city they are going to found, thinking back to the last lecture, is an anagram of amor, love. This is a city founded in love. And we are obsessed all the time, I think, with the text in coping with this process of giving birth, or founding something which is necessary to create. And it's in relationship to that foundation that one is assessed as being good or bad. And then we're thrown into, at this end, how does the man who does the right thing, the man of pietas, cope with an outbreak of violence and war? People who don't want to be ordered by, in terms of his foundation. The people, and this is where it's confusing, the indigenous inhabitants, the Latins, resist the Trojan coming, who is himself coming home. And we're told throughout that he's doing 2 things. He's leaving Troy, but that was his home, but it's not. He's leaving a destroyed home to come to his new home, but it's also always been his home. He's descended from the place to which he is ascended. And in the, that's entirely the wrong book, but it is worth reading. This is by Ursula Le Guin. She wrote the Earthsea trilogy, I think I read when I was a child. And it's a good introduction. I mean, she maybe it's a bit wrong lit, but she talks about Lavinia, who doesn't get talked about very much in the Aeneid, but she's going to be the future queen, and she's the one that the war is fought over. She's Turnus' betrothed. And then immediately Aeneas turns up, her father says, no, he's the man. And then the war starts. But she writes it from her point of view, and it brings some of this back. I would recommend it. I was actually reaching for the Aeneid, and to say there are, I don't know if you have this edition, but many have similar ones. We start with the zoomed out view. We go from Troy to Italy and Rome. Next page zooms in. We're going to have fighting in this area. Next page zooms in again, Rome itself. And I think there's quite a lot of that going on in the text, zooming down into Rome, but there's also a building up to this city that, as I said, is already there. In terms of the context, Virgil began writing the Aeneid in 29 BC. 10 years later, he wasn't finished quite when he died, and there was some editing done and tidying up. Virgil was meant to have been unhappy with the finished form, and there is some truth in that. There are some half lines in it. It's normally, well, it's written in hexameter verse, with 6 units in each line, and sometimes you only get half of it. He would have come back and worked it out. My view is not significant, and it's certain I don't think he would have reworked the ending. Sometimes people say, oh, he would have had with more time added on a bit more, and it wouldn't have ended quite so abruptly of death turns. I think that is conscious, and we'll come to that. But 2 years after starting the Aeneid in 27 BC, Octavian, who is Julius Caesar's nephew, and the surviving dynast of a long series, very long series of bitter civil wars in Italy. He's now the last surviving one because he's just defeated Mark Antony. They were in a triumvirate, Mark Antony, Augustus, and a sort of third party to make up the numbers who's not quite as important called Lepidus. He'd been got out of the way. It was Octavian versus Mark Antony, and there's a big naval battle at Actium in 31 BC, in which Augustus becomes Augustus, I suppose, through winning that battle. Octavian wins the battle and becomes the first Roman emperor. The Senate brings back the Senate of Republican Rome. He restores that, and he's very clear that he believes he is restoring a broken tradition of the Republic rather than initiating a new one, an empire. He's putting things back to the way they should be. And this restored Senate gives him the title of Princeps, Prince, first among men, first among equals, the man with the most authority. He is Augustus. He actually is authority. Augustus is derives from Bulgaria, to augment, to build upon a foundation. And through his victory in ending these civil wars of Roman against Roman, Augustus is preeminent, foremost princeps in authority, and he calls himself authority. No false modesty with this man. He now personifies authority as such, and it's that authority that he has won that allows him, interestingly, to make a step back from public life into private life. And he can put away his army, stop being a general, and come back into an ordered form of communal living when he doesn't have to have, or such is the presentation, he doesn't have to live in an armed camp all the time. A big contrast with his uncle, Julius Caesar. So of course Caesar, fighting Pompey, first before that he's in Gaul for 10 years. So he's given a huge command, lots of legions, goes and conquers all of France. And he spends a long time doing it, and as he gets closer and closer to the end of that 10-year grant of power, imperium, the right to be a general at the head of the Roman legions, as he comes closer and closer to that time, he faces up to a more and more pressing problem. He will have to surrender that imperium when his job is done, and come back into Rome without his army, without his devoted legionaries, and be open immediately to being put on trial by all his political enemies, of which he had very many. And so that's the decision that he's faced with, the crossing the Rubicon moment. He knows that there are so many enemies, he will immediately say, corruption charge this, embezzlement charge that, and he will immediately move into the process of defending his life and do a somersault from being the most powerful man in the world, I think, to voluntarily putting himself on trial. He thinks about this for a while and says, no, I'm going to keep the army with me, cross the Rubicon, alia iacta est, the dire cast, and he goes in, forms up a triumvirate With Pompey, it breaks down, there are more wars, new triumvirate forms, there are bloody executions of political rivals. There is an ongoing civil war between the next triumvirate we mentioned clearly, Lepidus and Antony, adventures in Egypt, Cleopatra, you know the story. But these ongoing wars, you might, they're not like the culture wars of today, you might call them virtue wars, because what is being fought for is the survival. It is around a question of how the individual, a man, via, in Latin, which is the root of the word virtue. Forget everything you've heard about virtue being talked about in the Greek Aristotelian questions, the question of excellence. For the Romans, virtue is a question of how to be a man. An individual has been fighting to survive in this work, in these wars, but they've also been fighting to demonstrate their virtue. How does a Roman demonstrate his virtue? By augmenting the foundation of Rome, building upon it, making Rome greater in a way that your great deeds will become examples for others to follow in the path of being a good Roman, insofar as you have made Rome greater. So they're doing two things. They're trying to be Roman, and they're trying to survive. And if Augustus comes up with a settlement to this, and we can read the Aeneid as something that reflects on this, maybe as a moral whitewashing of Augustus' settlement, or as a veiled attack, suggesting that a harsher truth underlies the appearance of moral probity. And so there is violence and the murder of Turnus underneath the settled order. And you can think about how you want to read it, but certainly through a lot of the book we are enmeshed in a world of contradiction and illusion and misleading prophecies and dreams and spirits in the underworld. It means that it's not always simple to understand what's going on. To say a little bit more about that, I can find where I put it, concept of it's easy to find where there's written a number 2. Roman morals. As I said, he's characterized by pietas, and it involves these themes of foundation. It also involves talking about tradition. And in Latin, the word for tradition is mos, M-O-S. And in the plural, it is mores, from which we get morality. And for a Roman, to be moral is to be traditional. What is traditional defines what is moral. And what matters, as I said, is the example we set by our actions. What is good is to act traditionally, and those who act traditionally lay down ways of acting for others who will follow them in generations to come. And it's that question of authority, auctoritas, is the main key one in understanding the Roman tradition. The valuation of continuity and stability, unlike the Greek experience in Athens of change and stasis. Continuity and stability for the Romans was the basis of their conception of authority, their answer to the question of how to lead a good life. Romans like to feel at home and form their identity on the basis of the sacred nature of Rome itself, the foundational event of their ancestors, who they feel, Frank talked about this yesterday in the concept of religion, Cicero, they felt bound back to the foundational, sacred foundational moment of Rome. And that was very important for them. The active foundation for them is itself tradition, the source of authority, the wisdom of their ancestors, the mos maiorum, the custom of our ancestors. Okay. I think it's worth saying that some of this, briefly, some of this concept or conceptual framework that Rome has developed is explicitly in opposition to Greek ways of thinking. Another way to be a good Roman is not to be a Greek. And of course, neither is Aeneas. he has that advantage. Greek colonists, Greek colonists, the reason I suppose I wanted to mention about not being Greek is with the Aeneid, it's an epic in Latin with a clear Greek precursor, Homer, and the Iliad and the Odyssey. But it is done not in continuation of a tradition. There is 700 years or so gap between Virgil writing the Iliad and Homer not writing. That's what you think. The Iliad. I say that, I'm not entirely joking. Homer was in a tradition. Again, think of Frank's point about the difference between being traditional, living a way of life, because it's the way of life, and being a traditionalist. Virgil is a traditionalist. He's picked up a tradition that's gone, and he's re-established it in a completely different form. This is not oral literature. And he's managed something great. He's created something new and great in doing the Aeneid with reference to Homer and in paying reverence to Homer through doing this. But he's also made very clear, I think, to you, its implied Roman reader, that he's done better. I've done the Iliad and the Odyssey, wrapped them up together, interpenetrated them throughout, and I'm head and shoulders above Homer. And that, again, was very Roman attitude. But in the 1st century BC, a lot of Roman writers, Catullus, Tibullus, Lucretius, were involved in a making new of Greek literature. They wrote love poems in an Alexandrine form, going better than their Greeks. They self-consciously called themselves Neotelesi, using a Greek word to show that they were new makers of the old. And Cicero himself, his great project, which I talked about a little bit last year, was a recasting into Latin of Greek philosophy, using Greek philosophy to give him the concepts he needed, rebranding them into Latin and underpinning the authority of being Roman with a Greek basis. Why am I good? Because I derive myself from the Greeks, but that makes me better than them as they came before. And there's something of that going on in the foundation, the putting underneath of a Trojan background, claiming everything that's great from the Greek tradition, as already having been there underneath anyway, because we read a lot in the Aeneid about how the Greeks came descended from Dardanus and Saturn from Italy. Now this is a homecoming. Okay. Back to the Aeneid then. As I said, the last 6 books, and in particular the death of Turnus, with which the poem ends. Let me just remind you of that. There's a lot of war in Italy. Aeneas fights Turnus, finally, long anticipated single combat between the two, wounds Turnus, who falls to his knees, and begs for mercy, or for clemency. If not forgiveness, he certainly begs for clemency, which Aeneas, as you know, rejected. He catches sword, sight of the sword belt of Pallas, the young son of Ander, who is the king of future Rome. He's been killed by Pallas, and he's wearing this sword belt as a trophy. Aeneas catches sight of it glinting, and his moment of hesitation, his eyes have rolled in hesitation. He may be about to extend clemency to Turnus. He sees the sword belt and thrusts his sword into Turnus' heart, and he is described as burning with fury and terrible anger. One of the other key terms in the Aeneid is this word furor, from which we derive fury. And he's been overtaken by his passions. This man always does the right thing, in the right order, and at the right time, all the way through the last 12 books really. a couple of exceptions. He's presented with, a new morning. What does he do? Get up, make libations in the right order. We're told that he did some sacrifices, and then he goes off. He's always doing this, and he's very sort of, equitable, just general, model of a Roman major general, you might say. And then bang, he sort of loses it at the end. He loses it when Pallas is killed. He runs around like a wild bull, and he's much more like a Homeric hero at this point, chasing this Turnus all around the battlefield, killing everything in his way, but Turnus has been attacked. But now he's got him, he's chasing his wounded in. We could have a resolution here. We could have an end to what is effectively a civil conflict between the indigenous inhabitants that are and the indigenous inhabitants to be, the Latins and the Romans. But no, we don't have a resolution. We have what seems to be a continuation of violence breeding violence. Turnus is wounded, down on one knee, hand outstretched, begging not for his own life, but asking Aeneas to spare his father the grief of his death, and they to be dispatched to hell. And there's a noise of a balloon being popped as the thin, shrieking soul of Turnus is dispatched. And this is a clear contrast, I think, to the end of the Iliad, where Achilles puts away his anger with Hector in a reconciliation with Hector's father Priam. He returns the corpse, a rather battered corpse by now. It's been around the city a few times, of Hector to his father, and there's a memorable and moving moment when Achilles raises the begging old man, the bereft father, Priam the king, up from his knees to his level. In a way, I think the reader sort of expects something like that at the end of the Aeneid. We're shown the same picture, a man on his knees begging for his father rather than his son. And the welcoming hand of acceptance is not reached out, very clearly, not going to be saying. So in that sense, we've got something new being worked out of old material. But it has always been something that troubles us at this point to say, is a more or less overt criticism of Roman values being made here? There is a break being made in intergenerational continuity. The son, thinking for his father, is killed. Surely this is an anti-traditional moment right at the end. And then people become inspired just to read back from that to make the whole thing as an anti-war, anti-imperialist poem, to show us the problems when invaders come from over the sea and impose themselves on the indigenous local people with force. They come off the landing boats with war, they kill people. Is this a criticism of Roman imperial colonialism, or is that an entirely invalid sort of 19th, 20th century reading back? But those sort of reading backs do have, a jump-off point in this killing of Turnus. What are we being asked to consider there? I thought I'd throw out some of the things that might help us in thinking about this. So there's a bit in the book about good and evil. We're told in book 8, when war is about to break out, Father Tiber, the personification of the river Tiber, if you remember, appears to Aeneas. Aeneas, by this point, is being called Father Aeneas himself. He's taken on the epithet of Pater Aeneas, which before had been his father's, Pater Aeneas. But he's now the father of Rome, and he's become an Augustus type of figure at this point. Father Tiber appears to Father Aeneas and hails him as the bringer home of Troy. Here is your destined home and the destined gods of your household. And he tells Aeneas what to do: form an alliance with the people of Evander. They are Greeks, descended from an Arcadian called Pallas. Aeneas does the right thing. He does the sacrifices, honors the river god. As a result, the flow of the river is reversed, and there's a beautiful moment, sort of calm, magical moment, as Aeneas' ship sort of floats the wrong way upstream towards the heart of the world. Palentium, as it is then called, but this is the site of the future Rome, and will be the Palatine hill on which Augustus himself will build his palace. and it is very hot, and this boat just drifts upstream, impelled by this force back to its origins, the bringer home of Troy. In this future Rome, Valentium, Evander and his son Pallas, when Aeneas arrives, are outside the city celebrating the Feast of Hercules. And Aeneas explains that I've got into this war because of excessive pride. Turnus is superbus. The war has been started because of the lack of moderation. It's been started by excessive personal ambition. Turnus' desire to become king by marrying Lavinia. And it's that same excessive personal ambition that I was discussing in the context of the civil wars, the virtue wars in the 1st century BC in Rome. As soon as the word superbus is introduced to any Roman listener, he thinks of the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, whose excessive pride, desire for another man's wife, led to his overthrow and the establishment of the Roman Republic by the long dead ancestor of the Brutus who killed Julius Caesar. So you're immediately thrown into that whole Republican tradition. So Superbus is bad. Pallas, the son of Evander, welcomes Aeneas in, who says that he's been driven there by the fates, but voluntarily. That is, egere volentem, driven by the fates, a willing man. And not time to talk about it now, but often there is that explanation on 2 levels. If you are a man who does the right sort of thing, you do what fate wants, but you choose it equally. He's been driven willingly by the fates to a union of Greek and Trojan, a consanguinity, to a position of becoming one blood. Evander, father of Pallas, says, I knew your father, Aeneas, and Anchises, he was a great man, they were feast. And in the feast, Evander tells Aeneas the story of Hercules and Cacus. There is a cave on the Aventine Hill in Rome in which Cacus, this sort of monstrous beast man, used to hide out in the dark. Now, in Greek, the word Cacus means kakos, bad or evil. Evander, euandros, means a good man. And we're explicitly being given a legendary story of a titanic struggle between good and evil. Hercules is wandering by the Aventine Hill with a herd of cattle. Cacus, which means that he is involved in sort of agricultural life, if you like. And Cacus, this monstrous force of nature, not involved in agricultural life, hears the cattle going by and slips out, breaks the rules of society by stealing 4 of them, 4 of his bulls and 4 of his heifers, brings them back to the cave. He's a cattle rustler who does not live by civilized values. He's betrayed, however, by the mooing of the bulls and the calves, which Hercules hears, and immediately goes into a furor of some considerable scale, so big that he rips the roof off the cave, sort of throws it in. Cacus responds with smoke and fire to hide himself in more darkness. Hercules isn't having any of this, jumps in there, leaps in, grabs Cacus, brings him out into the lake, and strangles him. Okay. What's the significance of this scene? Why explicitly at this point, just before Aeneas is given the shield, which is one of the great moments of the poem, or one of the linchpins of the moment, he's given the great shield, which has the future on it, and he puts it on. Arms in the man were the opening words of the poem. The arms that Aeneas will put on to fight are the future. He will actually wrap himself up in rather, in the flag, but in much more than that. The significance of the scene, I think, is to show that there was evil in the past. That evil is associated with an unordered state of nature. Men come and destroy that evil and create order in its place. More precisely, we see evil in the past because good men have created a standard in the present by which we can evaluate it. And they have created a standard which we need to continue to honor and maintain through a process of annual ritual. When Aeneas arrives and Evander and Pallas are outside having the feast, they are performing the ritual, an annual ritual of reverence to Hercules. So their founding story is that there was a culture hero of some kind, Hercules, who settled things down. They honor that every year. Evander, in this reading, you can see as being Augustus. Augustus, at the time of this poem being written, was also rebuilding Rome. Remember, Evander takes Aeneas on a little tour around Rome, and they're building. Well, Augustus was doing that at the time too. He boasted that he found Rome made of bricks and left it of marble. And there's significant that Evander's house, he has this narrow, little rather pooky dwelling, if you remember, on the Palatine Hill. The word used for it in the Latin is Angustus. And you would have immediately thought of Augustus when you heard this word, not just because of the sound similarity, but because, as I mentioned before, when Augustus had retired from public life, he had made a show of this stepping back from public life by building himself a markedly modest private dwelling on the Palatine Hill, next to the bling-bling palaces of the super-rich Roman aristocracy. He built this, not even really good enough for a sort of country gentleman kind of thing, not a palace. So when we hear Angustus, we know that we're being immediately put into a comparison between Evander and Augustus, and said something more about the right way to live. There's another level of comparison between the past and the future here happening at the same time that the implied reader would be aware of, because the annual feast of Hercules took place at the Great Altar in Rome on the 12th of August every year. And in 29 BC, on the 13th of August, Augustus chose to celebrate his triple triumph over the Battle of Actium. And it's that triple triumph at the Battle of Actium we see on the shield of Aeneas. Right? So there are very clear conscious links being made by Virgil between the foundational Cacus Hercules ritual and the new observational ritual. And so you have, I suppose it's the point I'm trying to get out through all of this, an ability through the way Virgil's posing this to celebrate, to found the new, and celebrate the new in relationship to the past. And so there's never any falling away from it. There is an unbroken continuation between the two forms of celebration. Augustus' celebration of his victory over Actium is every bit as Roman, every bit as traditional as way back into prehistory when Hercules slew Cacus. I think I mentioned that the furor of Hercules, the leaping into the cave, prefigures that of Aeneas chasing down Turnus. At the end, we have a temporal stacking up in these last books of the poem of levels of saviour heroes, culture heroes. Hercules, Aeneas, and Augustus, who all somehow become superimposed in the same place, if not at the same time. They're stacked up in each other in the same place. Rome is where it matters. They're all present in the same space through time and forever. Rome is the eternal city. It has always been this way. It will always be that way. And so if you like, there's a display here of a way of thinking of an evolutionary order. We go through warring heroes in the Iliad and the Odyssey to nomads at sea, journeying from a home but with no settled home, to a world of agriculture and settlement, to urban life, to truly civilized Roman life in which one has the ability to engage in reading and writing great literature about all this process and to live a life of beauty. So I suppose in that, if that reading is fair or compelling in any way, what Virgil is really showing us from the beginning of Book 7, when he launches on what he calls his pious opus, his greater work, is the story of how modern civilization began and reached its zenith under Augustus. He is undertaking in this poem to tell us how there arises a greater order of things through history. In book 7 we move backwards, as I said, zooming in towards home, through Latium to Rome, and forward on the shield of Aeneas to the future Rome. The shield itself is, of course, a work of art. It's a work of great beauty. And Rome, we're told, is to become one, with 300 large-scale shrines in it, where we can show reverence to where we have come from. Rome is to become the center of an ordered universe, to which, and this is the last scene that's described on this shield, it is the center of an ordered universe into which all the varied different people of the world over land and sea that Aeneas has travelled on march together in their different colours to pay tribute and reverence to the good thing that is Rome, because it is Rome and it has and always will be Rome. So the process of civilization advancing is crowned with the final laurel, which is art. Okay. And I think, apart from reminding you, I've sort of built it up like that now, but we do end, with a bloody moment. Are we to see that as fully justified as the violence that must precede civilization? Are we being said in any way that it's a necessary means to an end? Are we being asked whether or not there are limits to self-control? Or are we just being shown that Aeneas is in this process historically, and contrasted to Augustus, who was fairly bloody himself at the moment, but in times, but at the end brought the Pax Romana and closed the gates. It's his big boast in his account of his own achievements, Res Gestae, Augustin, the things done by the divine Augustus. One of his big boasts is that he closed the gates of war. You remember they get opened a few times in the course of this book, once by Juno herself, I think, kicks off the war in Latin. She kicks down the doors of the temple. So let me just end on that. I think right at the end, with Aeneas standing over the suppliant Turnus, we could feel that there's been enough human savagery. Aeneas has even gone in for human sacrifice. Roman has killed Roman. Everything is yearning for peace. And there's this one man who keeps standing in the way of it, Turnus. Or, if you prefer, Antonius, Mark Antony. Now, these may sound glib, but trust me, Virgil writes this way all the time. He's always playing with puns and sounds. Augustus, Turnus, Antonius. And it's backed up by what they do. Turnus Antonius, Mark Antony, is always breaking promises. A couple of treaties he breaks in this. He's told again and again what will go wrong. You'll kill Pallas, you'll suffer for it. In some ways his death is the necessary outcome of these predictions. And we should remember when Aeneas kills him, what Turnus says over the dying Pallas. When he kills Pallas, the son of Evander, he shouts out a message to Pallas' father, Evander, a good man, saying that he deserves to receive his son back, bloodied and mutilated. So, whose breaking of the intergenerational contract is it? When Turnus kills the son of Evander, or when Aeneas refuses to spare Turnus for the sake of his father. I think it's not entirely clear whether we're not being asked to it. I suppose I need to put my my view on it. I think, to some sense, there is an ongoing struggle to be free. So this is an Iliadic moment which comes back in to the Latin epic right at the very end. And in some sense, and some readers of it have said, you know, we are still bound by epic tradition. So when Virgil can't escape himself the legacy, entirely escape the legacy of the tradition in which he operates, he's had to be made a compromise with the choices he makes in establishing Aeneas in relationship to the characters of Achilles and Hector, start to bind himself in to a way of acting that ends in a resolution, a heroic resolution rather than a civilized resolution. Other readers say that there's a compelling case of saying that Aeneas is driven by an appropriate level of desire for vengeance, or that the amount of anger being displayed here is in this Aristotelian appropriate amount of anger in relationship to him and not to the thing, and that and other people say no, mercy would be a much more appropriate response to it. Maybe, and I'll conclude on this, maybe we're just left at the end with Aeneas as somebody who just didn't have enough freedom as an historical figure, not enough room for love of his enemy, even though I think that Roman readers could have expected something like that, courtesy towards one enemy. Maybe we're left with the thought that if we can increase our freedom, we will increase our ability to become more moral, or certainly it seems to me that the other way around must be equally true, that if we continue to act immorally, we reduce our scope and extent of our freedom. Aeneas does, for me, fall short of that perfect humanity, of what perfect humanity could achieve at the end of the poem, which of course leaves room for Augustus to achieve that. And it, you know, that may be wise for Aeneas to leave that room. But he is also saying that Augustus would not have been possible without Aeneas. And you have this temporal stacking in which the end is found in the beginning, and in the beginning is the end. And that.
Okay, to the back.
Just so, continuing at your last points about the ending and what it means and all different interpretations, I think perhaps one interpretation could be that Aeneas, because Aeneas isn't actually a Roman yet, he's still a Trojan, so it could be that perhaps his furor is a weakness, but it's seen as a Trojan weakness almost, and because it's before Rome is established, it's before presumably the Roman virtue of self-restraint is fully established, and perhaps Virgil is saying that he is, like you say, leaving room for that to develop. And I think perhaps, who knows, if he hadn't have died when he did, perhaps he could have done a sequel. I think he should have done a sequel on Iulus' rule, and then maybe Iulus will become that kind of inculcation of Roman virtue. But I thought also perhaps in having him kill Turnus, could that possibly have kind of granted some leeway to the awful things Augustus himself did, well, mainly as Octavian, but so thinking of like the conscriptions and also like his killing of Antony's child, could it be a kind of hint at saying, well, actually, you know, Augustus is all right and he's still our main leader, even though he did all these horrible things and didn't show any mercy. And then just finally, one kind of, another interpretation could be perhaps, it seems to be the inverse of the Iliad, where Achilles is the one who kind of is all crazy at the beginning and then he grants mercy, whereas Aeneid is consistently devout and the pious Aeneas and everything, and then you can kind of forgive him at the end for just having this breakdown. Like it's almost like he's had enough of being the good, following virtue all the time, and then at the end he goes his furor. And so, and perhaps because Achilles is Greek and Aeneas is going to found Rome and be the Roman side, perhaps it's contrasting again the Greek and the Roman, where Antony was seen as kind of Eastern and feminine, and maybe that, you know, Rome is better than the East. Yeah.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, following on that, I mean, I must admit I was very disappointed at the end, because Virgil almost sets this guy up as being the, you know, compassionate, does his duty, thinks about the public as opposed to his private life, and, you know, puts him up like a saint almost, a pious kind of person. And, you know, with Achilles, I actually expected him to kill him and everything else. And then Virgil, I just didn't anticipate, you know, Aeneas doing what he did at the end, which is all about, as you've said, about being very, you know, full of savage, almost acting like an animal as opposed to being, you know, doing the right thing here. So I must admit, I was disappointed, and it is interesting reading all the kind of different interpretations of it. But, you know, it's interpretations, and it may be that Virgil did want to contrast, you know, human behavior, you know, can take different forms, and this is how we ended. Can you say a little bit about Virgil as well, in terms of his, one of the things that came out of the, some of the readings was that his work was very much, you know, he obviously talked about Aeneas and the public life and everything else, but the work also showed quite a lot of drawings from other poets, if you like, which reflected on the private life of Romans, like, you know, when Aeneas turned away from, is it Dido, you know, and that was obviously a personal thing. So can you just say about that bit of it, the private versus the public? And obviously in this whole thing, the public takes, you know, precedence.
Yeah, just kind of departing from the question that we asked before. I'd like to know how the Aeneid was received by Augustus, especially that could have part of the fear at the very end. Was that would have been understood, in your opinion, as being a justification of Augustus's past actions, or perhaps a lesson for actions, for his future actions as the princeps, or was it a criticism? More interesting.
Okay, I'll just take Jacob, then I'll come back, and then there's a whole load more hands up.
Thank you very much for that, Angus. That was really excellent. The question I was making in comparison with Burke and sort of attempting to re-establish tradition. I wonder why you thought that Virgil was able to be like more successful, more creative than Burke's able to be. So if we take something like this from the lecture that Burke sort of failed because he's too pragmatic, that means he's boring in that sense. Whereas Virgil seems to like it's a new time inaugurating a new idea, and the sort of particularly Roman idea of always adding to, but continually being tied back to the foundations. And especially, is it, and I mean obviously a very like sort of chaotic political concept. Does that have something to do with it? Is it, and then the fact that is it just about such like a chaotic political concept? Does that have what to do with these ideas of like what elements is necessary to found this tradition?
What's the thing there? The Mark Antony. So the historical reality, of course, is that when the triumvirate of Octavian, Lepidus, and Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, divided up the world, Octavian picked the right bit. He picked the West, in particular Italy, to be his province. So they divided everything up. On paper, it didn't look like the right choice, because the money was in the east, and Egypt seemed to be the obvious choice because it was the breadbasket of Rome. So the grain came from there, and it was strategically important, and there's a huge amount of money in Asia in terms of taxation. So that's why Mark Anthony rather greedily said, well, I'll have that bit, and thought would be very smug thinking leaving Augustus with Rome. It didn't turn out that way. Anthony found himself distracted for some reasons, and also, maybe more importantly, it's very difficult to defend the western side of the Greek mainland against attack from the east. But the real underestimation here of Anthony is of the ability of the young Octavian, still pretty wet behind the ears, to be a superb organizer, which he duly proved himself to be. So I think that sort of parallel is set up. The Cleopatra figure, some relationships to Dido, don't dally around with foreign women in the East, get home. So I think there's some things being set up. I think you can see a possibility of maybe not a glossing over. In terms of the prescriptions carried out by Octavian, the one that stands out is Cicero, allowing Mark Antony his revenge on Cicero. And, Octavian was sort of told against his better judgment, makes that compromise to Antony Turnus, if you like. But we don't hear about Cicero in this book, or in any of Virgil's writings, and these absences in some ways notable, I think. So I think there is something suggestive in there, but I really don't know how much we can make on it. On the contrast to the Iliad, some critics of Virgil, some readings of it, as a book by a man called Granston, called Epic Narrative, or the Iliad Narrative, or something, I'll give you the title afterwards, who says that what Virgil has to do in the very beginning, as soon as he starts on this project of redoing the Iliad and the Odyssey, is write out the theme of Achilles' wrath. Because that would not be an appropriate motivation. So Achilles doesn't sulk, Aeneas doesn't sulk in tents, do any of that sort of thing, which seems entirely out of place with the concept of what a Roman should be doing. So he has to break all that out and find a way of motivating the story and the plot without it. But his argument is that it finds its ways of working itself back in, despite it, because you put yourself in that relationship to it. And so it does sort of emerge. It's a compelling reading. I recommend the book to you. Well, I don't know if it's compelling. It's an interesting reading. Disappointment at the end, disappointment, surprise, certainly. I hope it's not a letdown. Dido and Aeneas, private versus public. As you say that, I was wondering, is that a helpful contrast? Let me just start from where I think about it. Because when I read it, I think, well, what's she doing when he arrives? He arrives as a lonely wanderer, and he's completely alone. He's wrapped up in a cloud of invisibility, isn't he? So he gets this privileged view to see what she's doing, and he can't be seen. And what he sees is a woman acting like a man, but what's she doing? She's establishing a city, digging fields, she's creating laws, she's doing all the things that he should be doing, but in a sort of inversion of it. She's a man, she's a woman, not a man, and she's in the wrong place. She's not in Rome. Not only is she not in Rome, she's very much in the wrong place because she's in Carthage, right? Which Rome has fought for hundreds of years and then completely and utterly destroyed. Cato's famous phrase, "Raphago delenda est Carthage," which is what he used to say at the end of every debate in the Senate. And whatever the topic was about, now, shall we give this man Raphago delenda est, every debate was Carthage. The only thing that matters is destroying Carthage. Like in the present context, one might say that the only political thing that matters is destroying the EU, to pick an example. And they sow the field with salt and make sure they reduce it to waste. It will never be any use anymore. So, we're obviously being told to think about that. And to the extent that he stays there, he's delaying what he should be doing. And there is, I think, maybe a useful contrast between Aeneas in the first six and Aeneas in the last 6 books, which shows us the model in some ways of how Virgil thinks we should approach problems like this. Think about it for as long as possible, in a way that he can seem to be irresolute. He's a bit impatient for it to get on with it, but he's really thinking through all the options. He's always really trying to do the right thing. Could I do it here? Could I settle down here in the old city? Could I do it in Sicily? And then in Sicily you have this big problem. The women say, oh, we've had enough. We can't keep going with this. And he says, okay, I can understand that you haven't had enough. So you can stay and get on. That'll be all right. I need to keep going. And then he's at this feeling, now I'm at home. Now, then when he lands, he feels settled in himself because he is settled in the sense of being where he's meant to be. He's back home. And now he can act. He's been through all the thinking. Now he can act. And he does, and he's very different, is he not, I think, in the latter 6 books. He gets on with it, and he does that ordered thing. And, he's quite pragmatic, but he's not internally conflicted. And the diary of Aeneas, I think, is the real insight into that conflict. That's the way I look at it. I don't know if it helps with the private and public thing. I think they're both bound up. Would Augustus have liked it? I don't know if he would have liked the end, but we do know that he liked it. Virgil read it, bits of it to him. There's a moving scene at the end of book 6 where there's a young man shown us in the vision of Peter called Marcellus, who, I can't remember what relation he was to Octavius, but he was his nephew, and he was going to be adopted as his son. He died young, and we're showing him, and apparently the story is that when Virgil read this passage to Augustus, he floods of tears, very moved. Whether or not what he thought when he read, or had the read to him, not by Virgil who had died, but what he made of it, you have to speculate. I think he would have liked. Whether or not that means he would have approved of the King of Turnus, I have no idea. Burke and traditionalism. Why was Virgil a better poet than Burke? That's a big question. The question is really about why was Virgil why were the Roman traditionalists more successful in defending tradition? Is that the...
In creative, defending in creative.
That's a good question. The problem they face, of course, is the inadequacy of the Republican form of government to cope with empire. So they've got into a position through their Romanness and their Republicanness. They are an army. There's a Senate and the people. The people is the army. And they exist to fight, and they do it for centuries. And they're very effective at it. And in the process, almost without noticing, they created this empire. And in the first century BC, they start to have a problem with luxury and, with their freedom and what to do with it. They talk about that in various ways. Luxury being imported from the east by the Greeks. People are eating, too much fish, and having too much money, and they need to get back to their old ways of living. The real problem that they're reflecting on there is the one that I tried to introduce by talking about Julius Caesar, was the need to hold on to power to avoid being destroyed as an individual. And they didn't have a resolution to that method. So the early Romans, the people would be called to arms when they were attacked, they'd go off and fight their enemies, they'd come down and they'd put all the weapons away again and go back to farming. And that was the settled way of life. But when you've got this big empire, that's not an option anymore, and it becomes very dangerous to put down your arms. So in the process, they create a standing army, a professional army, and then that army has leaders to whom they're loyal. You can see what the problems are. How do you find a new form of government to deal with that? And Augustus is the solution. He sort of stops becoming a man, he becomes authority, he becomes a god. and takes himself out of that chain of cause and effect and violence, but at the expense, arguably, of his humanity. So the empire is, of course, successful in tradition, and there is peace for one of the longest periods in human history. In fact, around 100 years, a few exceptions, a few civil wars in Europe, but we'll gloss over that. You know, there's a long, long period of peace and a very high level of civilization attained, which you only need to compare to the Dark Ages that follow it to see how high it was. We had a lecturer a few years ago pointed out about the shrinking size of the cow. I thought that was quite a compelling thing. That cows at the height of the Roman Empire were much like cows as we know them now in size. In the Dark Ages, they shrink, meat, at least for all the animals, and that just as an index of what's lost is it was interesting. So, that authority being personified is important.
Okay. Yeah, you then fill behind it.
So coming back to this idea of Romans kind of explicitly drawing on the Greek tradition and Greek moral thought, and then essentially Romanizing it and to suit their own ends and to suit their own culture. I'm just wondering whether that sort of came back to haunt them, because it seems rather like, sure, we're Romans, we've put two fingers up to Homer and I've read down the Iliad and the Odyssey, but ultimately that's entirely superficially rooted in a culture totally divorced from Rome. So I wonder whether actually that came to be a sort of identity crisis in itself later on.
Couple of questions. I think you've already answered one, but I'll ask it anyway. Given your reading of it as, which I'm very sympathetic to, as a sort of traditionalist legitimation of the Augustan age, why is there any possibility of there being any other ending except killing of Turnus? Because if he'd been let live, obviously you'd have a different sort of moral take on it, but it would just be another uneasy settlement which would come to blows some other time. So it wouldn't be an end to a period of discord and fighting and triumvirate breaking down. There had to be something final in order to legitimate that there would be and anticipate a relatively stable, peaceful age to come. So my questions from that were, firstly on you made the point early on that you didn't think that Virgil would have expanded the end if he had time to rewrite. It would have left it abruptly. You said that was important to your thesis. So is your thesis then saying that you think Virgil was consciously wanting us to be thinking, not so much about the narrative, because I don't think you can say there could be any ending, but in terms of the moral complexities and the moral challenges, and he didn't want to make it any clearer as to the pressures that Aeneas was under and the apparent about turn in the way that his character turned into an action, which was obviously very surprising. So you're saying, is that ambiguity a necessary feature, you think, in terms of what Virgil was trying to do? And the second one, as I said, I think you have answered, is it seems to me that the link between the traditionalists of Cicero and the traditionalists of Virgil seems quite strong, and I think chronologically, it would be wrong. Virgil began to write after the killing of Cicero died, and that could have been a bit of a stimulus for it, that there was an identification. But I was wondering if there was any interaction between the two, and I think you said you didn't think there was any between Virgil and Cicero. I'd be interested to know if there was anything.
Russell.
I always have difficulty kind of picturing how the Aeneid was supposed to be consumed. In that, obviously, coming from being based on the kind of Homeric oral tradition that was to be performed effectively, and also that it was a piece of Augustan propaganda. One would assume that they wanted as many people to consume it as possible. But I don't know if perhaps you can correct me on this, that the Romans didn't have that same tradition as the Greeks, as the kind of the bard and people performing it. So I often picture it either being read, which would mean it was a pretty exclusive part of society who were consuming it, or that it was basically just an ego thing for Augustus. Perhaps that's because I always think of that thing of like Virgil reading to Augustus and being in tears or whatever. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Sean?
I think the disappointing bit about the ending is Turnus has just got to go. You know, it just has to. Obviously, it's a bit like Aeneas starts off as a kind of that kind of blank Homeric hero, and he by getting kicked about a bit by Hera, Juno, and all the other things that happen to him, he starts to sort of reflect, and he has no kind of Iliadic style. God's come upon him and makes him go mad or something. It's self-generated, and he gets kind of sent to school via Livy and Tacitus in the second half. He has to make all these kinds of weird journeys. He has allies that he must do. He has these strange, near the very, very end, after Turnus dies and just before, I can't remember, they say, oh, well, we're not going to establish our Greek culture, or our Trojan culture, or anything else, because it's destiny that he must found Rome. And it's unsatisfying because they say, well, okay, yeah, you can keep Latin. It's completely unsatisfying. Like, they don't have when you have that kind of military sort of a military sort of truce that's based on what language you're going to speak afterwards and how you're going to speak your culture. There's this tremendous destiny that must force the actions of everybody involved. And so that maybe that last bit that is so hard to read actually, with all the little battles and going backwards and forwards, it's a bit like, okay, here's a bit of Livy. I'm drawing you we've gone from the mythic Homeric down to the kind of quite recent histories that we have ourselves. You know, like when those books were endlessly fighting the Samians or something. You know, that kind of 20 odd years over and over and over again. And eventually just do have to work from that. They have to get rid of the women and find them somewhere. They have to. Angus is so detailed about what every little bit can mean. And the more he talks, the more you realise that nothing is left out or to chance. Every little bit means something to the work it's supposed to be.
Kevin?
Angus, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the life of the work afterwards, you know, its reception, but more importantly, its place in later Roman culture. Particularly because you get a sense there, I think, of almost an end of history, that Augustus comes in and ends the stability, then restores the sort of, the republican virtues. And there does seem to be this sort of constant theme that goes on brings the rest of Rome's history. Indeed, even after, I mean, if we go on with the idea of Rome, even into the Renaissance and into the 18th and 19th, to the contemporary day. So I wondered about that, but also this idea of sort of coming home, and the sort of the circle of coming home. That again seems to end things, but then there's a contradiction between Roman expansion and then Roman dynamism. So it seems to me that he seems to want to end, saying, well, this is the end now, we've got stability and so on. But whether there are sort of, again, loose ends left in it, and maybe even, I suppose, then this idea of the fates, and whether Rome is destined to be stable, or whether indeed it's sort of destined to be unstable. Now, one of the themes of a lot of the literature we've looked at has always been, these ideas, this sort of conflict between, fate, destiny, and where we're going, and then how we respond to that. And I think the sort of ending, and that's why I'm interested in its reception afterwards, seems to leave some of that open. It seems to sort of end it, but in other ways there is some sort of possibilities, which makes it, I suppose, quite an interesting work for me, much less sort of fixed, and there is the possibility of the sequel. It's almost rather like Aeneas 2. There's always that little ending that could come in.
Okay, so I'll take everybody who wants to speak, and I'll get Angus to come back comprehensively. Rob, then Paulie.
So just on this point at the back, I think what you did is you got your slave to read you. That's what they did, right? And so that'll key you into. I think it's difficult to be a lover of both Greece and Rome, right? And so classicists and students of the ancient world tend to have one that they really hold him up. And I'm on the Helen side, right? There's no doubt about that. And so it does set up. So my questions are about this. I mean, when you think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, right, they arise out of looking back to the age of heroes, an attempt to, a transference in some way into the historical mind, a way to think about where you've come from, which at least they think is in some way authentic, right? And they might have doubts about it. Whereas the thing which I almost can't get beyond with Virgil is that it's a self-conscious lie. It's a bit of, isn't it? It's a you know, they don't actually think that Aeneas has come from Troy to found Rome. He hasn't, because the Trojans don't found Rome. And so it's a kind of, so there is always this thing of fakery about it, right? Which is a kind of, which I think exactly connects with the point you were making about Burke and the traditionalism, because this is, you know, it's not a real tradition in a sense. It's something which is being created to justify the present moment. And because of that, maybe this is just me, my Grecian fascination, if you like. But I find that sort of colours every aspect of it when you look at it, and it kind of makes you think, so what's really what they're so damn uncomfortable about? Because of course they have got a great tradition, which is the real one, conquering most of the known world, but they have to kind of reach back further to kind of give it a bedrock that it doesn't really have. So just that really.
Yeah, just the this parallel between the story and what's happening in Rome, and I'm interested in the thinking about the cult of divinity, the imperial cult that is going to develop, and really this final part of the Aeneas, which leaves us. I think it's the manner of the death. It's not so much that he kills and he has to kill him politically, but the manner of it, in the sense that it's transgresses certain moral values, but also I think even in the description of the way that the dead man's soul kind of rebukes it. It's out there, it escapes him almost. And so, in the sense of this idea then of the cult of Augustus as a god, as a divine authority, it's almost like a fly in the ointment there. That would stay. That's a very powerful image. That there's something out there that is a rebuke to this. And I think it's in the cult of the emperor, this divine figure, you're sort of moving into icons and into images, into the creation of an image. And then subsequently then it is about attacking and defending an image. And the real life, the real moral life, the real virtuous life, which is about duty and striving, is over. There's nothing left to strive for. It's now competitive. How your image will, the image is actually the substance behind authority, not virtue.
Okay. Any final
Yeah. That's quite a lot. In no particular order, the consumption of the poem, yes, I mean, it was read out to people. To whom was it read out? More than Augustus. And by this time there were some libraries, not public lending libraries as such, but the self-aggrandizement of great men in Rome would have been to start building libraries as sort of vanity projects in the first century BC. And there was an intellectual, literary, very literary class of people who would have passed it around among themselves. Really speculating how many people read it at the time. I think, however, it had a wider influence at the time. It was part of an artistic project, of an important part of an artistic, self-consciously artistic project that Augustus was involved in. The building a city made of marble I mentioned, but the Paramaxima, and the Parapacus, the great altar and the altar of peace, are richly decorated with bas-relief works of art, temple building, it fitted into that. There was a conscious process to sort of cram life with art and peace, and people involved in it were aware of that project, and as well as other writers doing similar kinds of things, you know, Horace, Cleopatra, and all. And so, and again, we work in Greek literature, metamorphoses. So it has a wider influence. The question not to ask is, what influence did you have that on the people? It's not no interest. It's not. It's the narrow class of people who talk are involved in this discussion. But you ask a related question, I suppose, Rob, about is one a Hellenist or a Romanist? Well, fashion's changed at different moments through history. For a long time, people were Romanists, and it's with the 19th century onwards that people flip back to being Hellenists. But people came to Greece through Rome for a very long time. That was the way. So after the Dark Ages, it's through the rediscovery of the Cretians, the big impact on the Italian Renaissance, people reading Virgil, and it was also more difficult for them to read Greek. There is an outburst of knowledge of Greek when the Byzantine Empire falls and Byzantine scholars flee to Italy and then teach very quickly a generation of thinkers and intellectuals Greek, and there's a big rediscovery of Plato in the 15th century. But before that, people had Latin, so in the Machiavelli roots a lot of Latin, but didn't have Greek. So that's and it's also horses for courses. Cicero is hugely popular for a very long time, not by, just by Burke, but by the founders of the American Revolution, and everybody, every gentleman would read his little book on duties until sort of the American French Revolution, and then it dropped like a hot potato in the 19th century, and nobody's read it since. There is actually a resurgence of interest in Cicero within classicists at the moment. They're starting to turn to read him again. But those are some of the historical factors involved. And I think you can do both, actually. In a way, we will always still come to Greeks through the Romans. Can't really avoid that. And I don't know if it helps, but I always remind myself that they happen at the same time. In parallel. The Roman Republic is established as a republic possibly even slightly before, but a few years before, 510 BC. At the same time that Athens becomes something democratic, something republican. We don't think of it that way, though, do we? We always think of the Greeks very much preceding them. And it's because there isn't that flowering of culture at the beginning of Rome that there is at the beginning of Athens. It's political freedom, and it's there at the beginning, and with it becomes this outpouring of philosophy, tragedy, and so on. With the Romans, we have these centuries of sort of grinding ritual conflict going on, and really nothing much in the way of literature. The big flowering of Latin literature is in the golden age of the 1st century BC, at a time of war, but in a time of real flux in values. Everything's being put to the contest. Is this the right way to live? Is that the right way to live? It's being fought in a physical context, but there's an intellectual flux of ideas. There is also, at the same time with this conflict, the luxury and freedom through the spoils of empire, if you like, afforded to move away from this gentleman farmer existence and build libraries and theatres and start doing this sort of thing. So there is that massive explosion in this period of literature, philosophy in Cicero, and political theory in Cicero, all in that sort of turbulent period. And Virgil, sort of on a literary level, caps it off. I think he is sort of the end of that. I mean, there are Roman Latin writers to come. A great historian, Tacitus, Juvenal. There's even this sort of birth of the novel, if you like, in sort of vigorous form. But it's not of the same quality as what you see in the 1st century BC. It's been sort of rounded off, or that moment of excitement and freedom is gone. There's something that it was anything about it. With that cult of imperial divinity, and maybe you're right, Pauline, it's the image, not the substance, of the solution. We're trying to think a bit more about this question, how was that imperial project successful, as compared to Burke. We don't have that sort of problem of they didn't have the sort of problem of democracy in the same way to cope with. It wasn't really on the cards. They had been a republic, but to what extent the people were involved, other than being soldiers, wasn't there. And they had this option: the two big choices to be made were between Cicero or Augustus. And Cicero's view that it didn't carry the day, which is why he doesn't get mentioned. I don't know if Virgil met him, I don't think so. He certainly would have read him. But he can't mention him because he's the alternative that had to go, which would be the ongoing authority of the Senate. But that just wasn't working out. It's a way of administrating something the scale that Rome had inherited. And the authority of the Senate was shot and had to be re-established. How is it re-established? The authority of one man, who, interestingly, I mentioned Egypt earlier on. What does Augustus do immediately? He makes Egypt his personal possession. So everything rests on him. Nobody is allowed to go in there with his armies anymore. Only him. His personal possession, from which everything else puts itself at the heart of it. I'm not going to have time, I'm afraid. There are too many questions, so let's take them out with us. Just one thing to finish. I agree, though, there could be no other ending. I think it has to work this way. Does want to, Virgil, through it, want us to think about the moral conundrums? I think so. I think he wants us to think about what's good about peace by showing us the horror of war. I think it's very graphic about that, and very clear about the virtues of peace. And when you read his eclogues, his first 10 shorter poems, and then which are about a pastoral life, and shepherd boys playing flutes, love in the sun, and then his Georgics, which are 4 books of it presents a bit like a farming manual. It's not really, it's agriculture and what happens when we try and order the world and it breaks down because it's natural. You get disease and problems, and how do you cope with that? Up to the Aeneas, through his own progression as a poet, he's showing us that culture story of evolution. And I really get the feeling with Virgil is that he had it worked out from the very beginning what he was going to do. Anyway, he's involved in creating Augustus, I think, every bit as much as he is praising or flattering Augustus. There is a prediction in the eclogues early on that a hero figure, slightly Christ-like, will come and order the world. Go and read it. It was eclogue 4 or 6, I can't remember, but worth going to. And it's just his self-conscious artistic product building up to explain everything in increasing size, complexity, and scope of his ambition to take on at the end. Each of these books relate to different predecessors who he is taking on and beating, improving on each time in this self-imposed artistic competition, if you like, until he gets to the big guy at the end when he's matured enough to take on Homer. One last thought, because we're over time, about traditionalism and the failure of traditionalism. Rome endures, and it's a funny thing, the Pontiff is still in the Vatican, and there is in a sense, a line to be traced back to the Pontifex Maximus of Roman high religion. I just say that just to make you think, but not everything is a broken tradition, and we still carry within ourselves an idea of that importance of foundation and Rome as an eternal city.